A ruthless cattle king, a dying schoolteacher, a cowboy willing to sacrifice everything, and a battle for justice that would transform an entire community. In the drought-stricken frontier of Texas, powerful men believe wealth determines a person's value. But when Silas Woods risks his savings, his future, and even his livelihood to save a sick young woman named Maeve, a chain of extraordinary events begins. Corruption will be exposed. Families will be reunited. Lives will be saved. And from the ashes of hardship, a schoolhouse will rise where every child is welcome. This is more than a Western. It is a story about human dignity, equal rights, compassion, perseverance, and the simple truth that some things are worth far more than money. If stories like this inspire you, like, comment, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable Western journeys.
The sun don't care about mercy, not in Texas, and sure as hell not in the burning heart of June by noon. The sky over Red Creek Valley wasn't blue anymore. It was a bleached, angry white, pouring down a heat so thick you could taste the dust before it even hit your teeth. The earth was cracking open, splitting into gray fissures like withered skin, begging for a rain that hadn't come in 3 long seasons. Silas Woods pulled the brim of his Stetson down low, shielding eyes that had grown used to squinting at distant horizons. His shirt was glued to his shoulder blades, stiff with salt and the sour grease of trail sweat. Behind him, 50 head of scrawny, rib-flashed longhorns kicked up a choking red cloud as they shuffled into the holding pens of the Crone outfit. Old man Barnaby Crone stood on the top rail of the cedar corral, a heavy-set shadow against the glare. He didn't work. He watched men work. He held a brass-topped cane in one hand and a pocket watch in the other. Counting the minutes, Silas was late. "Move 'em out." "Woods," Crone barked, his voice like dry gravel shifting in a bucket. "I ain't paying you to give them cows a scenic tour of the flats." Silas didn't answer. A smart man saved his breath for the horse. He swung down from his dun gelding, his boots hitting the powdered dirt with a soft thud. He began unlatching the heavy iron gate, his movements slow, deliberate, and rhythmic. "Out here, hurry got you killed. Carelessness got you busted bones." A sudden sharp crack broke through the lowing of the herd. It was followed by a high, whistling scream, the kind of sound a horse only makes when the world goes entirely wrong. Silas turned. A young buckskin filly, barely 3 years old and broken only to the halter, was thrashing in the dust near the loading chute. She had caught her rear leg between 2 heavy pine logs, panicked, and snapped the bone clean below the hock. The jagged white splinter was already poking through the hide. Red and ugly, Crone didn't hesitate. He climbed down from the rail, his leather boots crunching loud on the stones. He reached into his coat, pulled a heavy Colt revolver from its holster, and cocked the hammer with a dull double click. Bang! The shot slammed through the valley, echoing off the dry bluffs. The filly went limp, her ribs giving one last, heavy heave against the dirt before the life went out of her eyes. Crone didn't blink. He wiped a speck of black powder smoke from his cuff and looked at Silas, his face as flat as a tombstone. "Out here, Woods. If a thing can't stand on its own 4 legs, it don't deserve my grass," Crone said. He holstered the gun, his voice casual, conversational. "That's just the law of survival. You feed what works, you bury what don't. A man starts carrying passengers, he goes under with them." Silas looked at the dead filly. Then he looked at Crone. "She gave you 3 good years of breeding potential, Mr. Crone," Silas said, his voice low, a quiet rumble in his chest. "A fractured leg can be set. Takes time is all. Takes patience. Patience costs money and time belongs to the bank." Crone spat, turning his back on the carcass. "A beast is worth exactly what it can haul to market tomorrow morning. Not a nickel more." Silas didn't argue. You couldn't argue with a man who calculated the value of a heartbeat in ounces of beef. Instead, Silas waited until the sun dipped below the rim of the world, turning the sky the color of a bruised plum, when the other hands went into the bunkhouse to gamble away their wages. Silas took a round-point shovel from the tool shed. He walked back out to the chute alone. The air was cooler now, but the ground was still hard as flint. Silas drove the iron blade into the dirt. Rhythmic and steady. Lift. He didn't do it because he was ordered to. Crone would have left the carrion for the buzzards and the coyotes. Silas dug because a living thing deserved a proper ending, a quiet hiding place beneath the soil it had trodden. Every strike of his shovel against the stone was a silent protest, a declaration that life, even a broken one, wasn't something you just tossed into a ditch when it stopped being useful. By the time the grave was deep enough, Silas' hands were bleeding through his leather gloves. He dragged the filly in, covered her up, and patted the earth smooth with the back of the blade. As he walked back to the main house, the kitchen door swung open. Crone stood on the porch, holding an oil lamp and a folded piece of yellow paper. "Woods," the old man called out. "Get over here." Silas stepped into the circle of yellow lamplight. "I got a chore for you," Crone said, tapping the paper against his palm. "This here is a foreclosure notice for the Gallagher place up on the North Ridge. Thomas Gallagher passed 8 months back, and his widow hasn't paid a dime on their $400 note. I want you to ride up there first thing in the morning." Silas took the paper. The ink was fresh, sharp, and cold. "You want me to drive 'em off?" Silas asked. "No." Crone smiled, a thin, humorless tightening of his lips. "I want you to inspect the property. Look at the structures. Look at what they got left. I'm going up there myself at noon to settle the account, one way or another. You make sure I know exactly what I'm trading for before I get there." Silas folded the paper and slid it into his vest pocket. He felt the weight of it against his ribs all through the night, heavy as a lead bullet, waiting for the morning to come. The morning ridge was quiet. Too quiet for a place where people were supposed to be living. Silas Woods rode the dun gelding up the winding creek path before the mist had even cleared from the valley floor. The air carried the sharp, clean scent of damp juniper, a brief deception before the sun rose high enough to bake the world back into dust. In his vest pocket, the yellow foreclosure paper scraped against his ribs with every stride of the horse. The Gallagher homestead wasn't much. It was a 3-room cabin built of rough-hewn cedar logs, a small lean-to barn that had seen better days, and a vegetable patch that looked like a losing battle against the heat, but the wood was joined tight. Someone had taken care with the notches. Silas pulled the dun to a walk as he reached the clearing. A young woman stood by the hand pump near the side of the house. That would be Abeely, the older one. She was built strong, with broad shoulders and sun-browned arms that didn't tremble as she lifted a heavy wooden bucket brimful of water. She had her hair tied back in a sensible knot, her face flushed with the early work. She looked like Texas, sturdy, unbending. Then Silas looked toward the covered porch. A second girl sat there, wrapped in a faded wool shawl despite the growing warmth of the morning. She was smaller, thinner, her skin possessing that translucent pale quality that made her blue eyes look unnaturally large. Maeve. She was holding a cracked slate tablet on her lap, a piece of white chalk held between long, slender fingers. Standing beside her was young Tommy, an orphan boy from the town down the ridge. His boots were split at the toe, his shirt missing 3 buttons now. "Tommy," Maeve said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried in the crisp morning air. It had a strange melodic rhythm to it, like water running over smooth stones. "Read the line again. Don't rush the fence. Let the letters tell you the story." The boy squinted at the slate, tracing a grimy finger along the chalk marks. "The road. The road goes where, Tommy?" Maeve prompted gently. She leaned forward, and as she did, a sharp, ragged cough tore from her chest. It was a dry, hollow sound that made her small frame shudder under the shawl. She pressed a white handkerchief to her mouth, holding her breath until the spasm passed. When she pulled the cloth away, Silas saw her quickly tuck the spotted crimson fabric into her sleeve. But she didn't stop. She didn't complain. She just wiped her brow and smiled at the boy. "Goes onward, Tommy. The road goes onward." Silas dismounted, the leather of his saddle creaking loud in the yard. Abeely dropped her bucket with a dull splash, her eyes instantly growing guarded as she recognized the Crone brand burned into the dun's hip. "We don't need no company," Mr. Abeely said, stepping between Silas and the porch. Her jaw was set. "If you're from the cattle outfit, my mother is inside. But she ain't got nothing for you." Before Silas could answer, a heavy thud of hooves shook the dirt behind him. Barnaby Crone rode into the clearing on a big black stallion that looked too expensive for the dust it was kicking up. He was dressed in his Sunday best, a dark broadcloth coat and a clean white shirt, though his eyes were as hard and gray as river flint. He didn't look at the land. He didn't look at the house. He looked at the 2 girls like a man checking the teeth on a team of mules. "Morning, Woods," Crone said, swinging down with a grunt. He didn't wait for Silas to report. He walked right past him, his iron-tipped cane digging into the dirt. Ruth Gallagher, the mother, came out of the cabin door then. She was a woman aged before her time, her apron gray from too many washings, her hands trembling as she wiped them on her skirts. "Mr. Crone, you said you'd give us until noon." "Noon is here when I say it is, Mrs. Gallagher," Crone said. Stopping in the middle of the yard, he leaned on his cane, pointing the brass top toward a Beely, then over to Maeve on the porch. $400 is a steep hill for a widow woman to climb, especially with a dry creek and a dead husband, but I am a reasonable man and prepared to make a trade. The yard went perfectly still. Even the cicadas in the brush seemed to stop their buzzing. "I need a strong pair of hands in my ranch kitchen," Crone said, his eyes settling on a Beely. "Someone to cook for the trail crews, scrub the floors, and keep the accounts straight. You let the young one, the healthy one, come back with me to work off the note. We'll call it $50 a month against the debt. In 8 months the land is yours again, free and clear." Ruth Gallagher gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Beely went white, her fingers twisting into the fabric of her skirt. Crone turned his gaze toward the porch, his lip curling just a fraction as Maeve let out another small muffled cough. "But the sick one stays here. Leave the sickly sister behind. She ain't got no use to a working ranch. She's just an extra mouth eating up rations that don't belong to her. Out here you don't waste good corn on a horse that can't pull the plow." Maeve flinched. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but Silas saw her fingers tighten around the slate until her knuckles turned as white as the chalk she held. She didn't look down. She kept her head up, staring back at Crone with a fierce, burning dignity that didn't belong in a broken body. Silas felt something shift inside his chest. It was an old weight, cold and heavy as a rusted anchor. He saw his brother Jacob lying under that juniper tree, gasping for air while the trail boss told the crew to keep moving because a sick boy was just a drag on the herd. Silas stepped forward. He didn't look at Crone. He walked right past the old man, up the 3 wooden steps of the porch, and stood beside Maeve's chair. "I'm taking the sick one," Silas said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a hardness to it that made Crone spin around, his boots scraping rough on the stones. "What did you say, Woods?" Crone barked, his face darkening. Silas reached down, gently taking the slate from Maeve's hand and placing it on the small side table. He looked down into her wide, startled blue eyes. "I said I'm taking the sick one, Mr. Crone. I'm leaving your payroll today, and I'll take the Gallagher note with me." "You ain't got $400, you damn fool," Crone sneered, stepping toward the porch. "You ain't got nothing but the horse you're riding and the shirt on your back." Silas reached into his vest, pulled out a small, grease-stained leather pouch, and tossed it into the dirt at Crone's feet. It landed with a dull, heavy clink. "There's $200 in gold in that sack. Every nickel I saved over 2 years of riding your fences. You take that for the first half." Silas stood tall, his shadow falling over Maeve like a shield. "The other 200, I'll pay you in labor," Silas said, his voice dropping into a steady, rhythmic cadence. "I'll work the winter timber lines. I'll break your wild horses. But you leave these people be. And you don't talk about this girl like she's a broken wagon wheel. She's got the consumption." "Woods," Crone shouted, pointing his cane at Maeve. "She's a ghost sitting in a chair. You're throwing your life away for a girl who won't see the winter snow." Silas turned his head slowly, looking Crone dead in the eye. "A human being isn't livestock for you to sort through." "Crone," Silas said, each word deliberate, carrying the weight of a spoken vow. "Her worth ain't measured by how much weight she can carry for you, or how many hours she can scrub your kitchen floor. A person has a right to be seen as a person, not a ledger entry. You feed what works and bury what don't, that's your law. But it ain't mine, and it ain't God's." Crone stared at him, his chest heaving under his fine broadcloth coat. He looked down at the leather pouch in the dirt, then back at Silas. He knew Silas was the best rider he had. He knew no one else would work the winter timber lines without a grumble. Lau Crone stooped down, snatched the pouch from the dust, and spat on the ground. "You're a fool, Woods, a natural-born prize-winning fool. You want a slave for a corpse. Go ahead. The note stays in my safe. You miss one payment, you lose your gold, and I take this land anyway." Crone swung back onto his black stallion, slammed his spurs into the beast's flanks, and tore out of the yard in a cloud of angry red dust. When the clearing went quiet again, the silence was immense. Ruth Gallagher was weeping softly by the door. Beely was still frozen by the water pump, staring at Silas like he was a madman who had just dropped from the moon. Silas turned back to Maeve. She was looking up at him, her lips trembling, a mixture of confusion and a strange, raw vulnerability on her face. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely louder than the breeze in the cedar trees. "You don't even know me, mister. I am sick." He wasn't lying about that. I might not see the winter. Silas reached down, picked up his Stetson from where he'd placed it on the rail, and settled it back onto his head. He looked out over the dry hills, then back down at her slate tablet. "I knew your brother Jacob's story, Miss Maeve," Silas said softly, "and I know that out here, people forget how to look at a person. They just look at what they can get out of them. You were teaching that boy to read when you could barely breathe. That tells me you're alive right now, and right now is the only time that matters." He offered her his hand. It was huge, dark from the sun, and covered in thick, rough calluses. "Come on," Silas said. "Let's get your things. We got a lot of work to do before the sun goes down." The old sod house sat at the back of the north ridge, tucked into a hollow where two limestone bluffs met like an open book. It had belonged to an old trapper who had died 3 winters back, and the land was mostly rocks, scrub oak, and wild blackberry briars. The roof was made of thick layers of prairie turf supported by cedar poles, and the front door hung crooked on rusted leather hinges. It wasn't a palace, it wasn't even a proper house, but it was private, and it sat on 40 acres that Crone couldn't touch. Silas had spent the afternoon hauling Maeve's small wooden trunk and her boxes of books up the ridge on a crude travois hitched behind the dun gelding. Maeve rode slow beside him, sitting sideways on an old army blanket, her face pale from the jarring journey but her eyes wide, taking in every rock and tree. By the time the sun began to drop behind the bluffs, painting the limestone walls in long streaks of ochre and violet, Silas had cleared the dead leaves from the floor and set her small iron cot near the back window where the breeze was freshest. Maeve sat on the edge of the cot, her knees pulled up under her faded skirt, watching Silas work. He hadn't stopped since they arrived. He had mended the door hinges with fresh strips of rawhide, cleared a space for a hearth, and was now kneeling in the dirt, striking a flint against a piece of steel over a nest of dry grass. Chink, spark. A tiny thread of gray smoke curled up and Silas blew on it gently, his breath steady until a small yellow flame licked at the cedar twigs. "You didn't have to buy my note, Silas Woods," Maeve said into the quiet of the cabin. Her voice was stronger now that she was out of the dust of the main road, but there was a heavy defensive edge to it. "I don't like being an obligation. I spent 3 years being the thing my family had to worry about every time the mercantile bill came due. I don't need another man looking at me like I'm a broken-down mule he has got to feed out of charity." Silas didn't look up from the fire. He added 2 larger chunks of split oak, watching the coals turn orange. "You weren't saved like a stray pup, Maeve," Silas said, his voice rhythmic, matching the steady crackle of the wood. "An obligation is something you're forced to carry. A choice is something you make because it's the right thing to do. You're a woman with a right to draw breath without asking a landlord's permission first. You don't owe me nothing but your company." He stood up, dusting the soot from his denim trousers, and looked at her. "I didn't buy a worker," Silas continued, his eyes steady under the brim of his hat. "Laucrone wanted a cook to save him $1. I wanted a teacher out here to remind me that the world ain't just mud and blood and cattle prices. A man spends too much time alone in the brush. He forgets what a civilized word sounds like. You teaching that Tommy boy that is useful, more useful than another pair of hands pulling a rope." Maeve looked at him for a long moment, the hardness in her face softening just a fraction. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound volume with gold lettering that had mostly rubbed off. "It's a geography book. My father bought it for me in San Antonio when I was 12. It's got maps of places where the rivers never go dry and the mountains have snow on them even in August." "Sounds like a good place to read about," Silas said, nodding toward the small iron pot he hung over the fire. "But right now you need to drink this." He took a tin cup from his pack and handed it to her. The liquid inside was dark, thick, and smelled sharply of bitter roots and wild sweetness. Maeve held the cup to her nose, her brow furrowing. "What is it?" "It smells like a swamp. It's horehound root, wild camellia, and honey from a hollow sweet gum tree down by the bottom," Silas said, sitting down on an upturned wooden crate across from her. "An old Cherokee medicine man named Running Deer showed me how to brew it when I was working the territory lines up north. It don't taste like sugar candy, but it'll soothe the heat in your chest. It helps the lungs hold on to the air." Maeve took a cautious sip, her face twisting at the bitterness, but she swallowed it down. As the warm fluid hit her throat, she felt a strange, soothing heat spread through her chest, easing the constant tight ache that had lived behind her ribs for 6 months. "My father always said the native folk were just savages," Maeve whispered, looking into the dark liquid. He said they didn't understand the land like a white man with a plow did. Silas pulled his pocket knife from his trousers and began whittling a small piece of pine, his hands moving with an easy, unhurried rhythm. The small white shavings fell into the dirt between his boots. "Your father was wrong about that, Maeve," Silas said softly. "The land don't belong to the man with the loudest voice or the sharpest plow. The land remembers who treats it with respect." Running Deer knew every root that grew in the shade because he knew that everything out here has a purpose if you take the time to look for it. He used to say that medicine don't come from a fancy bottle in a store. It comes from understanding what the earth gives you when you're willing to listen. He looked up, his gray eyes catching the reflection of the firelight. "That's the trouble with men like Crone," Silas added, his voice dropping into that conversational, storyteller cadence. "They think if you can't sell a thing at a market, it don't exist. They don't see the value in a root growing under the dirt, and they don't see the value in a person who can't work 20 hours a day in the sun. But a tree don't stop being a tree just because it don't bear fruit every season." Maeve swallowed the rest of the tea, setting the empty tin cup on her trunk. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she didn't feel the need to hide her face or apologize for her next breath. Silas didn't flinch when she coughed, and he didn't look at her with that heavy, suffocating pity that her mother and sister always carried. He looked at her like she was just another part of the ridge, like an oak tree that had survived a hard winter and needed a little time to find its leaves again. "Silas," she asked, her voice small against the darkness that had settled outside the door. "Yeah, Maeve. You think we'll ever see that snow in August?" Like it says in the book. Silas stopped whittling. He looked at the small pine stick in his hand. He'd carved it into the shape of a tiny, wild cedar bird, its wings spread out as if it were about to take flight from his thumb. He stood up, walked over to her iron cot, and laid the little wooden bird on her blanket. "I reckon we will, Maeve," Silas said, his voice low and certain as the stones beneath the floor. "The road goes onward, remember. We just got to keep walking until we get to the hills." He walked to the doorway, pulling his bedroll out onto the small covered stoop outside, where he could watch the horse and the trail below. He didn't say goodnight with a lot of fancy words. He just pulled the cedar door to, leaving it unlatched a few inches so the cool night wind could slide through the cabin, carrying the scent of the wild earth and the promise of another morning. The heat came back hard on the third Tuesday of July. It wasn't just hot. It was the kind of heavy, greasy air that sat on a man's chest like a wet saddle blanket down in the creek bed. The mud had dried into gray crusts that curled up like old boots, and the grass looked like rusted needles sticking out of the red clay. Silas spent the morning working the boundary stone line, his shoulders blistered red where the suspenders rubbed his linen shirt raw. He was sweating through his boots, but his hands stayed steady on the heavy iron crowbar. Lever, heave, set. He was moving the boulders to form a ditch to catch the runoff if the sky ever decided to break. A horse was coming up the ridge trail. Silas heard the iron shoes striking the flint before he saw the rider. It was a fast, ragged gallop, the kind of riding that meant a man was fleeing a fire or a woman was running out of time. It was a Beely. She swung down from her mother's old plowmare before the horse had even come to a full stop. Her sunbonnet was hanging down her back by the strings, her face pale beneath the dust and the streaks of dried sweat. She didn't look like the strong girl who could lift a water bucket without trembling. She looked small, she looked hunted. "Silas," she gasped, her hand catching her side as she struggled for wind. "You gotta come. You gotta help us. Lau Crone, he's down at the cabin with the county sheriff." Maeve came out of the sod house then, her movements slow but deliberate. She had a damp cloth pressed against her throat, her blue eyes fixing on her sister with a sudden, sharp intensity. "A Beely. What did he do?" "Silas paid the 200. He's got the receipt right there in the tin box." "It ain't about the cash no more," Abeely cried, her voice cracking like dry kindling. "Crone brought a new paper, a legal paper from the circuit judge down in Austin. He says the $400 note was a demand note, not a time loan. He says since father died, the estate ain't got a legal executor under Texas law, so he's calling the whole thing due by tomorrow noon unless—" Abeely stopped, her fingers twisting so tight into her apron that the seams began to pop. She looked down at her dusty boots, her jaw shaking. "Unless what?" "Abeely," Maeve asked, her voice dropping into that quiet rhythmic hardness she used when she was fighting the cough. "Unless I agree to sign a marriage covenant with him," Abeely whispered. "He told mother he'd burn the note, and settle 50 acres on her for life if I marry him before the circuit judge leaves the county on Friday. He says a gay old man needs a young healthy wife to keep his house from falling to pieces. Silas dropped the iron crowbar. It hit a limestone rock with a sharp, heavy clink that echoed off the bluff. He didn't curse. He didn't spit. He just pulled his bandana from his neck, wiped the red dust from his eyes, and looked at the two sisters. "He don't want your cookery, Abili," Silas said, his voice low, a quiet rumble that sounded like distant thunder over the flats. "And he sure as hell don't want a wife to keep his linen clean. Let me see that paper your mother gave you." Abili pulled a crumpled page of legal foolscap from her bodice and handed it over. Silas didn't read fast. He'd learned his letters late from a trail boss who kept an old Bible in his saddlebag. He ran his thick, calloused thumb down the ink lines, skipping the high-toned Latin words until he found the numbers and the legal description of the Gallagher homestead. "Look here, Maeve," Silas said, pointing with his whittling knife. "Look at the section lines. He ain't just foreclosing on the house. Yes, taking the north corner, the piece with the deep limestone sinkhole." Maeve stepped closer, her breath coming in short, shallow puffs as she looked at the map drawn in the margin. She had read her father's old books on earth structures and water tables until the pages were thin as onion skin. Her eyes widened, the pale skin around her temples turning tight. "The underground spring," Maeve said, her voice dropping into a harsh, clear whisper. "The one father found when he dug the well through 40 feet of solid rock. That well didn't go dry in the drought of '57. And it ain't gone dry now. Crone's main cattle tank down at the home ranch is nothing but cracked mud. His steers are dying in the brush by the dozen." Silas nodded, folding the paper and sliding it into his vest pocket next to his own skin. "That's the size of it," Silas said, looking at Abili. "This whole business, the ultimatum with the sick sister, the demand note, the marriage covenant, it's nothing but a cattleman's leverage. Under the laws of 1878, a married woman can't hold property separate from her husband unless there's a trust deed drawn before the vows, and a widow woman can't defend her land in a county court without a male kin to sign the writ. He's using the law like a skinning knife, Abili. He's trying to strip your rights away before you even know you have them." Maeve stepped down off the sod porch, her hand reaching out to grab her sister's trembling wrist. Her voice was steady, rhythmic, carrying the authority of a woman who knew the weight of words. "You listen to me, Abili," Maeve said, looking her sister dead in the eye. "You will not sell your life to that old wolf for 40 acres of grass. The law in this territory might look at a woman like she's nothing but a saddle or a heifer to be traded between men, but your soul don't belong to Barnaby Crone. It don't belong to the county judge, and it don't belong to mother's debts. You have a right to your own life, Abili, a right to say no when a tyrant tries to buy your body with a piece of paper. If you give up your freedom to save a patch of dirt, you spend the rest of your days living in a cage you locked yourself into." Abili looked at her younger sister, the tears finally spilling over her dusty cheeks. "But the land. Maeve's father killed himself clearing those stones. If we lose the spring, mother ain't got nowhere to go." "We'll find a way," Maeve said, her fingers tightening around Abili's arm. "But we fight 'em straight. We don't buy our peace with a woman's slavery." Silas didn't say another word. He walked to the lean-to barn, hauled his heavy stock saddle onto the dun gelding, and pulled the cinch tight with one hard, practiced jerk. He didn't reach for his Winchester rifle, not yet. A man who pulled a gun before he used his head usually ended up swinging from an oak limb or rotting in the Huntsville pen. He swung into the saddle, his face set like the limestone bluffs behind him. "You stay here with Maeve, Abili," Silas said, looking down from the horse. "Keep the door latched. I'm going down to the blacksmith shop in town to see Elijah. If there's a legal knot being tied in this valley, Elijah usually knows which string to pull." He wheeled the dun around, his spurs clicking sharp against the stirrup irons, and disappeared down the ridge trail in a storm of red dust, leaving the sisters standing together in the heavy heat, their shadows intertwined on the hard-packed earth. The town of Dusthaven wasn't much more than a wide spot in the trail between San Antonio and the hills. It had a mercantile with a rusted tin roof, a livery stable that smelled of old manure and wet straw, and a saloon where the beer was always warm and the whiskey tasted like kerosene. At the end of the street sat the forge. Elijah was there, his massive, dark arms glistening with sweat as he held a glowing orange horseshoe against the anvil with his tongs. Clang, clang, clang. The sound was the heartbeat of the town, rhythmic, steady, and loud enough to drown out the wind. Elijah was a big man, born a slave in Georgia, But he walked into Texas after the war with nothing but his bare hands and a hammer. Now he was the best blacksmith in 3 counties, though he still couldn't buy a drink at the front bar of the saloon. Silas hitched the dun to the rail and walked into the dark, smoky heat of the shop. He didn't speak until Elijah finished the shoe and dropped it into a barrel of rainwater with a loud hissing shut. "You look like you carried a heavy load up the hill," Elijah said, wiping his brow with a greasy leather apron. He had a deep, quiet voice that sounded like it came from underground. "Crona's moving on the Gallagher place," Silas said, leaning against the wooden post. "He's using a circuit court demand note to force a Beely into a marriage covenant. He wants that deep well on the North Ridge to water his steers." Elijah went still, his dark eyes fixing on Silas through the smoke of the forge. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a plug of tobacco, and bit off a piece, chewing slow. "Lau Crone's been buying up paper all over the valley. He thinks because the new railroad line is coming through next year, he can freeze out the small holders and own the whole right-of-way." While they were talking, the bell over the side door jingled. Young Tommy came running in, carrying a sack of charcoal for the forge. His face was dirty, his boots split at the heel, but he smiled when he saw Silas. "Mr. Woods," the boy said, "Maeve gave me a new slate yesterday. I can write my whole name now, Tommy." Elijah looked down at the boy, his large, scarred hand reaching out to touch the boy's shoulder. As he did, his fingers brushed against a small ornament hanging from the boy's neck by a dirty leather string. It was an old carved bone button, 5-sided, with a tiny star scratched into the center. Elijah froze. His whole body went rigid, the heavy iron tongs slipping from his hand and hitting the dirt floor with a dull thud. He didn't look at Silas. He didn't look at the forge. He just stared at that little bone button like it was a ghost risen from the grave. "Boy," Elijah whispered, his deep voice shaking so hard it sounded like a cracked bell, "where did you get that thing around your neck?" Tommy pulled back, frightened by the intensity in the big man's eyes. My mother gave it to me before she got put on the train in Mississippi, when I was real small. She told me to keep it safe so she could find me again." Elijah knelt in the black dust of the forge floor, his knees sinking into the charcoal shavings. His huge hands were trembling as he gently lifted the little button between 2 fingers, his face turning gray under the grease. "Sarah," Elijah whispered, a single tear cutting a clean white line down his dark cheek. "My Sarah made this. She carved it out of an old beef bone behind the kitchen cabin in Liberty County. She made 3 of 'em, one for her, one for me, and one for the baby boy they took from her arms in the spring of '65. There were no loud cries in the blacksmith shop. There was no theatrical weeping. Elijah just reached out and pulled the orphan boy into his massive chest, his great shoulders shaking in silence as he held the son he'd spent 13 long years searching for, through every territory and trail camp in the West. Tommy didn't run. He felt the steady, safe beat of the man's heart through the leather apron, his small arms reaching around Elijah's neck like he'd finally found the anchor he didn't know he was looking for. Silas stood in the shadows by the door, his hat held against his thigh, his eyes turning misty as he watched the reunion. He knew the history. He knew what the war and the old system had done to families like Elijah's, turning human souls into cargo, scattering them across the wild frontier like chaff in the wind. The law had called them property then, and the law still looked away now, but the blood didn't forget. Elijah finally stood up, wiping his face with the back of his hand. He looked at Silas, his eyes clear and full of a sudden, dangerous resolve. "Silas," Elijah said, his voice dropping into that hard, rhythmic cadence that meant business, "you go back up to that sod house and tell Maeve she ain't alone in this fight. You tell her that human rights ain't something that can be bought with a cattle king's gold or hidden in a circuit judge drawer." Elijah walked to the back of the forge, moved a stack of heavy iron wagon tires, and pulled an old leather-bound ledger from a hollow space in the wall. He brought it over and laid it on the anvil, tapping the cover with his thick finger. "For 12 years, Silas," Elijah said, looking out the open door toward Crona's High Valley Ranch. 12 years I've done the iron work for Barnaby Crone. I shot his horses, mended his branding irons, and rebuilt his buckboards. Every time I asked for my legal wages under the Reconstruction Acts, he told me he'd credit it against my lease on this shop or settle it when the beef market went up. I couldn't read much back then, but I knew how to count and I knew how to draw a mark for every dollar he withheld. This ledger right here has every hour, every nail, and every dime he owes the free laborers in this valley. Lau Crone thinks he owns the law because he's white and he has got land, but the law says a man's labor belongs to him, And a debt is a debt, no matter who holds the pencil. He owes me and my boys over $800 in back wages, and that S more than enough to cover the Gallagher note twice over. Elijah slammed the ledger shut, the dust flying from the leather cover. "We go to the courthouse tomorrow, Silas," Elijah said, his voice steady as the anvil. "Not with guns, we go with the record. We show that judge that a man's dignity and a woman's freedom are protected by the same law that keeps the banks in business. He wants to play with paper. We'll give him a sermon he won't forget." Tommy stepped up beside his father, his small hand slipping into Elijah's massive palm. Silas looked at them both, then nodded, his Stetson settling back low over his eyes. "Tomorrow then," Silas said, "at the courthouse." The wind changed at 3 o'clock on Thursday afternoon. It didn't blow cool. It blew hard and wild from the south, carrying a taste like hot copper and old cinders. Silas was up on the roof of the sod house, securing the cedar poles with fresh rawhide, when he smelled it. It wasn't the sweet, greasy smell of oak firewood from a kitchen stove. It was the sharp, oily reek of burning mesquite and dry sagebrush. He stood up, his hand shading his eyes as he looked toward the southern flats. A long, thin line of black smoke was rising against the white glare of the horizon, moving fast, rolling over the hills like a dark wave. "Silas." Maeve called out from the doorway. She was holding her handkerchief tight against her mouth, her eyes wide as she watched the sky turn the color of an old kettle. "It's S, the prairie fire. It's S coming from the bottomland." Silas scrambled down the log ladder, his boots hitting the dirt hard. "The wind is driving it straight up the draw. It's heading right for Crone's main cattle barns." Abeely came running out of the garden patch, her apron full of green beans she'd been trying to save from the heat. "Let it burn," she said, her voice shaking but angry. "Let the whole thing burn to the ground. It's nothing but the judgment of God on that old man." Silas didn't answer right away. He walked to the water barrel, dipped his bandana into the tepid water, and tied it tight around his nose and mouth. Then he grabbed a pair of heavy burlap sacks from the lean-to and dropped them into the bucket. "Get inside the cabin, Abeely," Silas said, his voice low and flat through the cloth. "Latch the shutters tight. If the fire jumps the creek, you take Mother and head into the limestone sinkhole. The air stays cool down in the rocks." "Where are you going?" Maeve asked, her hand catching his sleeve. She was coughing already from the first thin drifts of yellow smoke that were filtering through the trees. "I'm going down to the flats," Silas said, looking down at her hand. "Elijah's shop is right in the line of the drift, and Crone's got 20 head of young horses locked in the cedar pens near the creek. They can't jump the rails." "Silas, no," Abeely cried, stepping between him and the dun gelding. "That man tried to ruin us. He's down at the courthouse right now trying to steal our home. Why would you risk your skin for his stock?" Silas swung up into the saddle, his fingers gathering the leather reins with a steady, unhurried precision. He looked at Abeely through the rising haze, his voice carrying that rhythmic conversational cadence of a man who had thought on these things long before the fire started. "Out here, Abeely. The brush don't ask who owns the grass before it burns it," Silas said. "A fire don't care about demand notes, and it don't care about skin color or who owes who a dollar. When a living thing is trapped in a cage, you don't stop to look at the brand on the gate before you pull the latch. If we let them horses burn out of spite, we ain't no better than Barnaby Crone when he left my brother Jacob to die on the trail because he wasn't useful no more. We save what we can because it's alive, Abeely. That's the rule of the country. A man starts picking and choosing who deserves to be saved based on a ledger or a grudge. He throws away his own humanity. He becomes just another wolf in the brush." He didn't wait for her to answer. Silas slammed his spurs into the dun-s flanks and tore down the ridge trail, the horse hooves striking sparks off the limestone as they plunged into the yellow curtain of smoke. The valley floor was an oven. The air was full of black flakes and burning leaves that swirled in the wind like angry hornets. As Silas reached the creek road, he saw Elijah already there, his massive frame silhouetted against a wall of orange flame. The blacksmith was using his heavy iron sledgehammer to smash the cedar locks on Crone's holding pens. Thwack, thwack, split. With every blow, the heavy pine rails shattered, and the panicked horses came bursting out, their manes singing, their eyes wild with white terror as they fled toward the river gravel. Silas jumped down, his wet burlap sack swinging as he beat out a line of fire that was creeping toward Elijah's fuel pile. They worked together in silence, two men moving in perfect rhythm against the heat, their skin black with soot, their lungs burning with every breath. They didn't talk about the courthouse. They didn't talk about the past. They just fought for every inch of dirt, their shared labor a silent, unbreakable bond in the face of destruction. By the time the wind shifted again, driving the fire away from the town and into the rocky bluffs where it died against the bare stone, the sun was gone. The valley was nothing but a black, smoking waste, smelling of sulfur and burnt grease. Barnaby Crone rode into the yard on his black stallion. He looked old. His fine broadcloth coat was torn at the shoulder, his face gray from the ash. He looked at his shattered pens, then at the 20 horses standing safe in the river shallows. Then he looked at Silas and Elijah, who were sitting on an overturned water trough, their hands bleeding through their gloves. "You cleared the pens," Crone said, his voice cracking, stripped of its usual bluster. He didn't look at Elijah. He looked at the dirt between his horse's ears. "Why, I didn't ask you to ride down here, Woods." Elijah stood up, his massive height throwing a long, dark shadow over the blackened ground. He wiped his face with his apron, looking the cattle king dead in the eye. "We didn't do it for you, Mr. Crone," Elijah said softly. "The horses belong to the field, and we belong to ourselves. We do what's right because we're men, not because you paid us a wage." Crone didn't answer. He turned his horse around and rode slow toward the town, his head down, a solitary figure moving through the ruins of his own kingdom. The rain came on Friday morning. It wasn't the hard driving storm they'd been praying for, but a soft, steady drizzle that washed the black ash from the cedar trees and turned the red clay into a thick, cool paste. Up at the sod house, the air was clean again. Maeve sat by the window, her wool shawl tucked around her shoulders as she watched the mist roll over the limestone bluffs. She was coughing, but it was a different kind of sound now, weaker, more exhausted, like an engine that had run out of fuel. The excitement of the fire had taken the last of her reserve strength. The door jangled open, and Doc Mercer walked in, his old leather medical bag slung over his arm. He didn't look like a fancy doctor from the East. He looked like a man who spent too much time in a buggy, his coat smelling of damp horsehair and carbolic soap. Silas came in behind him, carrying a fresh load of dry oak wood for the stove. Doc Mercer didn't say much at first. He sat on the edge of Maeve's iron cot, pulled a silver watch from his vest, and held her wrist between his old fingers, counting her pulse in the quiet room. Then he took a small wooden tube, pressed it against her back, and listened to her lungs while she drew 3 shallow breaths. "Well, Maeve," the doctor said, pulling away and tucking his watch back into his pocket. "You're still here. That's about the best thing I can say for you today. Your heart's beating steady. But those lungs of yours sound like a wet blacksmith's bellows. This Texas heat is drying you out, and the smoke yesterday didn't do you no favors." Maeve smiled, though her lips were blue around the edges. "I'm still teaching Tommy, Doc. He wrote cat on the slate this morning, without me telling him the letters. That's fine for Tommy, but it ain't curing your blood." Doc Mercer sighed. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope. The paper was crisp, white, and carried a round, purple stamp that said Boston, Massachusetts. "This came in the mail sack on the stagecoach last night. It's addressed to you, Maeve, personally." Maeve's hand trembled as she took the envelope. She used her whittling knife to slice the seal, her eyes moving fast across the black ink lines. As she read, her face didn't go white. It went bright. A sudden, deep flush of color came into her cheeks, her pale blue eyes turning wide and sharp as she looked up at Silas, who was standing by the stove with his arms crossed. "Silas," she whispered, her voice cracking with a sudden wild energy. "It's Seth from the Massachusetts Medical Institute. The letter I wrote 8 months ago, they answered it." "What letter, Maeve?" Abeli asked, coming into the room with a plate of cornbread. "Before Father died," Maeve said, her fingers clutching the paper tight. "When Doc Mercer told me I had the consumption, I found an old medical journal in the schoolmaster's cabin. It talked about a new study, a real science experiment they redoing with people who have the lung sickness. I wrote to the director. I told him how old I was, how much I weighed, and exactly what color the handkerchief was when I coughed. I didn't ask for money. I asked if they had any space for a girl from Texas who knew how to keep a record." Doc Mercer nodded, his old eyes serious behind his brass spectacles. "The Institute has a new Chinyanga clinic up in Denver, Colorado, Maeve. They retesting a treatment based on high-altitude air, fresh pine oil, and a specific compound made from wild silver fir bark. They say the early results show 60 out of every 100 patients get their strength back if they start before the lungs turn to stone. And because of your letter, Maeve, they re-offering to pay for your room and your medicine if you can get yourself to the clinic within 30 days. Abeli dropped her plate, the cornbread scattering across the dirt floor. "Denver. That's 800 miles away, Maeve, through the territory. We ain't got the fare for a stagecoach, let alone a train ticket. Maeve stood up from her cot, her shawl sliding to the floor. She didn't look like a sick girl waiting to die anymore. She stood straight, her jaw set with the same unyielding grit that Silas had shown at the corral gate. "We'll find the fare a Beely," Maeve said, her voice rising clear and rhythmic through the small cabin. "I didn't write that letter because I wanted someone to come down here and give me charity. I wrote it because I knew that if a person wants to live, they have to be the first one to step onto the trail. Quien som the right to fight for your own life. It don't come from sitting in a corner and praying for a miracle while you wait for the undertaker to measure your box. It comes from looking at the world, finding an open door, and having the courage to walk through it, even when your legs are shaking. I am going to Denver Abili. I'm a-going because my mind is still healthy, and I got too many things left to teach to let my body rot in this red dirt." Silas didn't say a word. He walked to the corner of the room, picked up his leather saddlebags, and began checking the buckles. He took his small tin savings box from under the bed, opened it, and counted out the remaining silver dollars he'd kept back from Crone. Only 20 pieces of coin left after the foreclosure payment. It wasn't enough for 2 tickets to Colorado, not even close. But he didn't hesitate. He slung the bags over his shoulder, his face calm and certain as he looked at Doc Mercer. "Who is the ticket agent down at the railhead in Austin, Doc?" Silas asked. "An old fellow named Miller," the doctor replied, watching the cowboy with a quiet, knowing look. "He used to ride with the Texas Rangers before the war. He don't care much for cattle barons, but he's partial to men who know how to handle a horse." Silas nodded, settling his Stetson low over his eyes. "I am riding down there tonight. I got a good dun gelding and a silver-mounted bit that's worth $50 to a man who appreciates old Spanish ironwork. We have them tickets by Sunday morning, Maeve." Maeve looked at him, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. "You don't have to sell your saddle iron for me, Silas Woods. You need that horse. A horse is just a thing that gets you from one place to another." "Maeve," Silas said, his hand resting on the latch of the cedar door. "But a real purpose. That's something a man can ride his whole life and never tire the legs out of it. You get your books packed. We going to see that snow in August." He stepped out into the soft morning rain, the door clicking shut behind him with a firm, quiet finality, leaving the cabin filled with the scent of wet pine and the first real hope that had crossed the ridge since the wells went dry. The county courthouse in Dust Haven wasn't much more than a 2-story limestone box with a small bell tower on top. It stood at the center of the muddy square, its white oak doors swollen tight from the morning drizzle. Inside, the courtroom smelled of wet wool, stale tobacco, and the damp cedar shavings the janitor used to clean the floors. Circuit Judge Alderman sat behind a high walnut bench, his spectacles resting on the bridge of his crooked nose as he looked over his papers. He was an old jurist, a man who had seen the frontier change from a republic to a state, and his eyes had the flat, unblinking look of a hawk perched on a telegraph wire. Barnaby Crone sat at the long table to the right, flanked by a young, slick-whiskered lawyer he'd brought in on the stagecoach from San Antonio. Crone's face was still gray from the smoke of the prairie fire, but his black broadcloth coat was brushed clean. He held his brass-topped cane between his knees, his fingers tapping a fast, impatient rhythm against the metal. The door at the back of the room creaked open. Silas Woods walked in first, his mud-splattered boots leaving heavy dark tracks on the pine floorboards. Behind him came Elijah, holding young Tommy by the hand. Elijah wasn't wearing his leather blacksmith apron today. He had on a clean white linen shirt, his broad shoulders squared, his head held high. In his left hand, he carried his battered leather ledger, the edges wrapped in a piece of grease-stained canvas to keep the rain off the paper. "Mr. Woods," Judge Alderman said, leaning forward over his bench, "you relate?" Mr. Crone's attorney has already entered the motion for immediate foreclosure on the Gallagher homestead. Under the rules of this court, the time for filing a counter-writ passed at 10 o'clock. The young lawyer from San Antonio stood up, adjusting his silk cravat with a smirk. "Your Honor, the matter is simple. The defendants have defaulted on a $400 demand note. My client is legally entitled to seize the property to satisfy the judgment. The law is explicit about the rights of a creditor when the contract is broken." Silas didn't look at the lawyer. He walked straight to the center of the floor, pulled his hat off, and rested it against his thigh. "The contract ain't broken, Judge," Silas said, his voice low, a steady, rhythmic cadence that filled the quiet room like the sound of a horse walking on packed river gravel. Because the debt is already paid, in full, Crone scoffed, slamming his cane against the floor. He's lying, Your Honor. He threw a pouch of gold in the dirt on Tuesday, but it only totaled $200. That's a partial payment, and the law don't recognize half a cure when a note is called due. That pouch was the first half, Silas said, turning his head slowly to look at Crone, and here is the rest. He nodded to Elijah. The big blacksmith stepped forward, his boots heavy but deliberate on the floor. He laid the canvas-wrapped ledger on the clerk's table, unfolding the cloth with broad, scarred fingers that had spent 30 years shaping iron. What is the meaning of this? The young lawyer protested, waving his hand in dismissal. This court don't accept informal account books from unregistered laborers. My client's business is regulated by the state banking acts. Judge Alderman raised his hand, silencing the lawyer with a single sharp look. He peered over his spectacles at Elijah. State your business. Elijah, you know the rules of evidence in this county. Elijah placed his hand flat on the leather cover of the ledger. He didn't shout, he didn't lean on the table. He stood tall, his voice carrying the deep, unbending dignity of a man who knew exactly where his boundaries were drawn. This here is the record, Judge Elijah said, his words coming slow, rhythmic, matching the ticking of the big clock on the courtroom wall. For 12 years, I've kept the ironwork running for the Crone outfit. I shod every steer horse, mended every axle tree, and sharpened every plow blade that went onto his land. Every time the work was done, Mr. Crone told me he'd settle the account at the end of the season, or he'd credit it against my shop lease. But under the laws of this territory, the new laws enacted after the war, a man's labor is his own property. It ain't a favor, and it ain't a gift. A working man has a legal right to be paid an honest wage for the sweat of his brow, regardless of his skin or his past. Queen Bing Dong, the equal right to have your contracts enforced. It means my pencil is just as legal as his ink. This ledger shows that Barnaby Crone owes the free workers of Red Creek over $800 in back wages. I'm assigning $400 of that credit to the Gallagher family to cancel their note today. The young lawyer opened his mouth to shout, but Judge Alderman snatched the ledger from the clerk's hands. He turned the pages one by one, his old finger tracing the charcoal marks, the small drawings of horseshoes, and the neat rows of dates Elijah had recorded with meticulous care. The courtroom went perfectly still. Crone's face didn't turn red. It went a sickly, hollow white, the brass top of his cane trembling against his trousers. He looked at the book, then he looked at the window, his chest heaving under his fine broadcloth coat like a steer that had been caught in a blind draw with the wolves closing in. Mr. Crone, Judge Alderman said, his voice cold as a winter well. This ledger has your own brand mark stamped at the bottom of every section page from 72 to 76. You signed for these services. It was an informal arrangement, Your Honor. Crone stammered, his bluster completely gone. The Negro didn't have no legal standing to demand a cash settlement back then. The Constitution says he does now, Judge Alderman said, slamming his gavel down with a sharp crack that made the young lawyer jump. And this court finds the account valid. Furthermore, the district auditor's report came in on the morning stagecoach, Mr. Crone. Your notes with the San Antonio Bank are currently defaulting to the tune of $3,000. You overextended, sir. You didn't come to this court to settle a legitimate contract. You came to steal a water hole to save yourself from bankruptcy. The judge pulled a black pen from his desk, dipped it into the inkwell, and wrote 3 words across the face of the Gallagher foreclosure paper. Kakana by debit. He handed the paper to Silas. The land belongs to the widow Gallagher, Judge Alderman said, looking down from his high bench. And the clerk will issue a citation against the Crone Cattle Company for the remaining $400 owed to Elijah. This court is adjourned. Silas took the paper, folding it tight and sliding it into his vest pocket next to his heart. He walked out of the courtroom into the soft Texas rain, Elijah and Tommy walking beside him, their shadows broad and steady on the wet stones of the square. Their victory won not with lead or black powder, but with the quiet, undeniable truth written down in an old leather book. The trunk was packed by Saturday night. It sat near the door of the sod house, its pine corners reinforced with old iron straps Silas had salvaged from the forge. Inside were Maeve's 3 woolen dresses, her father's old Bible, and every textbook she owned, each page wrapped in clean newspaper to protect them from the damp. The rain had stopped, leaving the night air cool and smelling of wet cedar and sage. Down in the valley, the lights of Dust Haven were small, distant sparks against the black bulk of the hills. Maeve sat on the edge of her iron cot, her knees pulled up, her fingers tracing the smooth wooden bird Silas had carved for her. She wasn't coughing tonight. The soft rain had settled the dust, and her breath came easier. Though she still looked small and frail against the dark log walls, the door jangled open, and Abeli came in. She had a lantern in one hand and a small tin box in the other. Her face looked different than it had all week. The hard, sharp lines around her mouth were gone, replaced by a quiet, soft expression that Maeve hadn't seen since they were children playing in the creek bottoms. Abeli set the lantern on the table and sat down beside her sister, the straw mattress creaking under their weight. She didn't speak for a long time. She just looked at the packed trunk, her fingers smoothing the fabric of her apron. "You really going then?" Abeli said, her voice small and tight in the quiet room. "The stagecoach leaves from the Mercantile at 7 tomorrow morning. Silas has the horses ready," Maeve said, looking up at her sister. "He traded his silver bit to Miller for the rail tickets from Austin to Denver. We re-going, Abeli. We have to." Abeli reached down and placed the small tin box on Maeve's lap. "You take this with you. It ain't much, but it'll buy you some fresh milk and a warm meal when you get to the high country." Maeve opened the lid. Inside were $3 silver, a pair of old horn-handled sewing small scissors, and a folded piece of yellow paper with a blue ink stamp. It was a postal receipt from the Dusthaven Land Office, dated 8 months back. Maeve pulled the receipt out, her brow furrowing as she held it close to the lantern light. The address on the paper was written in a neat round hand, not her own, but Abeli's. It was addressed to the Massachusetts Medical Institute, Boston. "Abeli," Maeve whispered, her breath catching in her throat. You sent the letter. But I thought I lost it. I thought it fell behind the flour bin when I had that bad spell last winter." Abeli looked away, her eyes turning glossy in the yellow light. "You didn't lose it, Maeve," Abeli said, her voice cracking just a fraction before she caught herself. "I found it when I was scrubbing the floorboards after Father's funeral. I read it. I know I shouldn't have, but I did. You wrote so beautiful about the sickness, Maeve. You didn't cry, and you didn't ask for pity. You just asked if there was a place for a girl who wanted to be useful before her light went out." Abeli reached out and took Maeve's thin hands between her own, her grip tight and warm. "I didn't have no money for the long-distance stamp, Maeve," Abeli said, looking her sister dead in the eye, the words coming out in a rush. "So I took Mother's silver thimble, the one grandmother brought over from Ireland, and I sold it to the mercantile clerk for 50 cents. I sent that letter because I was ashamed, Maeve. I was ashamed because every time you coughed, I'd look at you and think about how much the medicine cost and how we were going to lose the north pasture if we couldn't pay the interest. I let that old wolf crone make me blind, Maeve. I let the fear of being poor make me look at my own sister like she was a ledger debt or a broken wagon wheel that was dragging us down into the mud. But when Silas Woods stepped up on that porch and took your hand, he taught me something I should have known all along. If a family throws away its own blood just to save a patch of dirt, they throw away the only part of them that's worth keeping. A person's life ain't a burden, Maeve, it's a gift, and if we don't fight for each other out here, the wilderness wins anyway, no matter who owns the deeds." Maeve didn't answer with words. She just leaned forward, her small frame burying into her older sister's shoulder, her arms wrapping tight around Abeli's neck. They held each other for a long time in the quiet sod house, the tears running silent down both their cheeks, washing away the months of bitterness, the unspoken anger, and the heavy walls of fear that had kept them apart for so long. The hug was the real healing, not the medicine from Boston, but the simple, redemptive return of love between two sisters who had almost let the dry country break them. The door opened slow, and Silas stood on the threshold. He had his coat on, his Stetson held in his hand, his eyes quiet as he looked at the two girls. He didn't interrupt. He just picked up the heavy pine trunk by the iron handles, lifted it onto his broad shoulder with one easy, practiced motion, and walked back out to the wagon. Abeli stood up, wiping her face with her sleeve, and helped Maeve wrap her wool shawl tight around her chest. "Go on now," Abeli said, her voice steady again, a small proud smile on her lips. "Silas is waiting, and Tommy's down at the gate with his father. They want to see you off before the trail gets crowded." Maeve walked out the door into the cool, dark morning, the sky in the east just beginning to turn the color of a pale gray dove. She looked back once at the small sod house. Then she took Silas' hand and climbed up onto the high wooden seat of the buckboard. Her face turned toward the north ridge where the road went onward, clear and wide into the hills. The train didn't move like a horse. A horse has a rhythm you can feel in your thighs, a steady breathing stride that matches the rise and fall of the trail. The steam engine was different. It was a massive iron beast that shook a man's bones. Iron wheels striking the steel joints of the rails with a relentless heavy clack-clack, clack-clack. It smelled of black grease, hot coal smoke, and the sour wool of 50 strangers packed into a wooden coach with the windows shut against the flying cinders. Silas Woods sat with his back to the engine, his long legs cramped into the narrow space beneath the bench. He had his Stetson pulled down low over his eyes, apparently asleep. But he wasn't sleeping every time the whistle shrieked. His fingers would twitch against his knee, a reflex from 10 years of listening for a stray steer in a midnight brush run. Across from him, Maeve sat with her face pressed against the glass. The red dirt of Texas was gone now. The flat, thorny brush of Red Creek Valley had given way to the high, rolling plains of New Mexico, and now as the sun began to drop behind the western rim, the first blue shadows of the Rocky Mountains appeared on the horizon. They didn't look like hills. They looked like giant, jagged teeth cutting into the pale sky, their peaks tipped with a strange white glitter that didn't belong to the summer. "Silas," Maeve whispered, her finger tapping the pane. "Look there, is that the snow?" Silas lifted the brim of his hat with one finger, squinting through the dust-streaked window. "That's it, Maeve. That's the ice that never melts. It stays up there in the high draws where the sun can't reach it." Maeve let out a long, slow breath. She didn't cough. The air up here was different, thin, sharp, and smelling of cold stone and pine resin, instead of the baked clay and old cattle dung of the low country. Her cheeks had a small, faint touch of pink to them, like the first petal of a wild primrose after a morning dew. The train slowed with a screech of iron brakes, pulling into the Denver station just as the oil lamps were being lit along the platforms. Denver wasn't a frontier town like Dust Haven. It was a city built of red brick and granite, with 3-story hotels, sidewalks made of smooth stone flags, and the constant, busy roar of mountain wagons and silver ore carts clattering down the middle of the street. Silas carried her trunk on his shoulder, his large frame carving a path through the crowd of miners, railroad speculators, and fine ladies in silk dresses. He didn't look at the buildings. He didn't look at the shop windows. He kept his eyes on Maeve, his hand catching her elbow every time a heavy dray wagon rumbled too close to the curb. The Massachusetts Medical Institute Chinning sat on a quiet hill north of the town, surrounded by a grove of tall ponderosa pines. It was a long, low building made of whitewashed logs, its wide porches filled with rocking chairs where people sat wrapped in heavy blankets, staring out toward the blue peaks. Dr. Margaret Chen met them in the small office near the door. She wasn't an old country doctor like Mercer. She was a young woman, sharp-eyed and quiet-spoken, wearing a clean white apron over a plain blue dress. She didn't use a wooden listening tube. She had a new instrument with 2 rubber earpieces that she pressed against Maeve's chest while she noted the numbers in a leather ledger. When she finished, Dr. Chen took off her spectacles and looked at Silas, then at Maeve. "You've come a long way, Miss Gallagher," Dr. Chen said, her voice clear and even. "The letter you sent us was precise, but the trail is hard on lungs like yours. You have a shadow on the left side, and the air passages are tight from the dry dust. I won't lie to you. This compound we use, the silver fir extract, it isn't a magic spell. It requires 6 months of absolute quiet, 3 meals of fresh beef fat and cream every day, and nothing but this mountain air in your mouth." Maeve nodded, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "I didn't come for a magic spell, doctor. I came for a chance to finish my work. I have a school to build back in Red Creek." Dr. Chen smiled, a small, genuine softening of her sharp face. "A woman with a purpose usually mends faster than one without. We have a bed ready for you in the East Ward. Mr. Woods, you may leave her trunk here." Silas didn't follow them into the back room. He stood in the hallway until the door closed, his hat held against his thigh. Then he walked back down the hill into the gathering dark of the city. He needed a job, and he needed it before his last 5 silver dollars turned into bread crusts. He found work at the Denver rail yard before the whistle blew at midnight. It wasn't cowboy work. There were no horses, no wide horizons, and no cool evening breezes under the stars. Silas spent 12 hours a day in a dark, roaring shed, using a 20-pound iron sledgehammer to straighten the bent coupling pins of the freight cars. Lift, swing, strike. The iron hit the anvil with a deafening clang that made his ears ring for hours after the shift was done. His hands, already scarred from the Texas wire, broke open in fresh, bloody blisters under the friction of the hickory handle, but he didn't miss a swing. He didn't complain about the heat of the forge or the black coal dust that filled his mouth. Every strike of the hammer was 20 cents toward Maeve's fresh milk. Every mended pin was another week she could stay on that pine hill where the air didn't hurt her. 6 months went by like the turning of a heavy book page. By January, the mountains were buried in white, the snow drifting 5 feet deep against the logs of the clinic. Silas would walk up the hill every Sunday afternoon, his old boots wrapped in strips of gunny sack to keep his toes from freezing in the slush. He defined Maeve sitting on the glassed-in porch, a thick wool quilt around her lap, her slate tablet held between fingers that had grown steady again. She wasn't pale anymore. Her skin had the clean, bright look of the mountain snow, her voice carrying that melodic, rhythmic strength that Silas had remembered from the first morning he saw her at the hand pump. She was teaching 3 young boys from the neighborhood sons of the Irish tracklayers, who lived in the shanties near the river. They sat on the floor around her chair, spelling out the words she wrote on the board with her white chalk. "Look, Silas," Maeve said, her eyes shining as he stepped into the porch. Billy read the whole page about the salmon rivers without a single mistake today. Silas took his hat off, the melting snow dripping from the brim onto the floorboards. "He's doing well, Maeve. He looks like he's ready for the advanced reader." When the boys left, running down the snowy path with their slates tucked under their coats, Silas sat down on the wooden bench across from her. The fire in the soapstone stove was low, casting a soft orange glow across her face. "Dr. Chen spoke to me before I came up the steps," Silas said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "She says the shadow on your lung is gone, Maeve. She says the scar tissue has cleared up tight, and your blood is as healthy as any woman's in the territory. She says you're free to go home whenever you're ready." Maeve went still, her fingers tightening around her whittling knife, the one Silas had given her before they left Texas. She looked out the window toward the white peaks of the Front Range, where the winter wind was blowing the snow off the ridges like long, silver banners. "Home," Maeve whispered, her voice carrying a strange, heavy hesitation. "Dust Haven don't feel like home anymore, Silas. The Gallagher land is safe because of Elijah's ledger, but there's nothing on that pasture but old memories and dry grass. There's a schoolhouse needed down there, Maeve," Silas said softly. "The town council voted last month to set aside 3 acres near the church for a public school. They ain't got a teacher yet." "I want to teach 'em," Maeve said, turning her head to look at him, her blue eyes dark and serious. "But I don't want to live under my mother's roof like an extra mouth anymore. I want to build something real, something that belongs to the future." Silas reached into his vest pocket. He didn't pull out a fancy gold ring from a jewelry store in San Antonio. He pulled out a small, circular piece of bright wire, a length of tough double-strand steel fence wire he'd found in the rail yard, polished with emery cloth until it shone like old silver, its ends twisted together into a neat, tight knot. He took her right hand between his own huge, calloused palms. "I don't own no land in Texas anymore, Maeve," Silas said, his voice steady, rhythmic, carrying the simple weight of a trail vow. "I spent my savings buying that first half of the note from Crone, and I sold my dun horse to get us onto this train. I ain't got nothing but these 2 hands and $20 in my pocket from the rail yard work." He slid the wire ring onto her finger. It fit snug against her skin. "But a home ain't a legal deed you buy from a land office, Maeve," Silas said, looking her dead in the eye, each word deliberate, conversational, yet unyielding. "And it sure as hell ain't a patch of grass you protect by shutting out the people who need you. Giadin, a real family it's made of the folks who choose to stand together when the brush fires are burning and the water goes dry in the wells. It's built out of respect, out of the choice to see another person's soul as something valuable, something worth working for every hour of the day. I spent 3 years looking for a piece of dirt I could call my own, thinking that having my name on a boundary stone would make me a man. But I was wrong about that. A piece of dirt is just mud until you find the person who gives that land a reason to mean something. I want to build that schoolhouse for you, Maeve. I want to cut the logs, set the rafters, and nail down the floorboards so you can stand at that board and teach every child in that valley, whether they be rich or poor, white or black. I want to give you a home, Maeve, not because you need a master to protect you, but because I want to spend the rest of my days riding the same trail with you." Maeve looked down at the wire ring on her finger. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She just turned her hand over, her long, slender fingers wrapping tight around his thick, scarred knuckles. Her grip strong enough to let him know she wasn't ever letting go. "You build the walls, Silas Woods," Maeve said, her voice clear, melodic, and full of a sudden bright certainty that sounded like spring water breaking through the ice, "and I'll keep the fire inside. We'll go back to Red Creek together." She leaned forward, her face moving out of the shadows, and pressed her lips against his cheek, a single, soft kiss that smelled of mountain pine and the clean, cold wind of the high country, sealing a promise that had begun in the dust of a Texas corral and found its fulfillment beneath the white peaks of the world. The wind over Red Creek Valley blew sweet in the September of 1879. It carried the scent of ripe wild plums from the bottoms and the dry, golden smell of cured grama grass that covered the ridges like a thick wool blanket. At the crossroads 2 miles north of Dust Haven, the new schoolhouse stood bright against the green oak grove. It was built of round cedar logs, each one notched tight and clean at the corners, the pine roof shingles smelling of fresh resin in the afternoon sun. Above the white oak door hung a flat piece of limestone, carved by a blacksmith's chisel with 6 clear words, "Red Creek School, all welcome," inside. The room was full of the quiet, busy murmur of 12 frontier children sitting at the long pine benches. Maeve Woods stood at the large slate chalkboard, her dress made of clean blue gingham, her hair tied back with a sensible ribbon. She was writing the spelling words for the afternoon lesson, her hand moving across the slate with a swift, confident rhythm. She didn't look like the pale girl who had wrapped herself in a shawl on the Gallagher porch. Her arms were brown from the sun, her lungs clear and full of a deep, steady breath that didn't stumble. In the front row sat young Tommy, his face clean, his new leather boots polished to a high shine. Beside him sat 2 children from the Mexican sheep camps down the ridge, and at the back bench sat a Beely youngest cousin, their heads all bowed over the same reader. The door opened slow and Silas walked in. He had his tool bag in his hand, his leather vest worn open over a clean blue shirt. He'd spent the morning fixing the water trough by the well that Elijah and Silas had deepened over the winter until it struck a cold, limestone current that would never go dry. He didn't speak, he just stood by the back wall, his hat held against his leg, watching his wife finish the lesson. Behind him, through the open window, the sound of iron striking iron came clear from the crossroads shop. Clang, clang, clang. It was Elijah's forge, running steady, a free man working his own iron for an honest price. His son Tommy waiting to take over the bellows when the school bell rang at 4 o'clock down the road. Barnaby Crone's old home ranch sat quiet, its fences broken, its cattle sold off to the San Antonio banks 3 months back to pay his debts. Lau Crone had left the territory on a night stagecoach, a broken old man with nothing but a leather valise and his brass cane. His name already fading from the ledger sheets of the valley. Maeve turned around from the board, her eyes instantly finding Silas through the rows of children's heads. She smiled, a quick, bright flash of light that made him look down at his boots to hide his own grin now. "Children," Maeve said, her voice filling the room with that warm, rhythmic strength. "Put your slates away for the day, Tommy. You read the final passage from the board before we dismiss." The boy stood up, his shoulders squared, his thumb tracing the star on the old bone button that still hung around his neck over his collar. He looked at the white chalk marks, his voice clear and proud as he read the lines Maeve had written for the closing of the term. "The road goes onward," Tommy read, his finger following the rhythm of the letters, "through the dry land and the mountain snow. A man walks with his neighbor, and the weak find their strength when the true heart leads the way." Silas nodded, his hand reaching up to settle his Stetson back low over his eyes as the children scrambled out the door into the golden evening light. He waited by the threshold until the room went quiet. Then he stepped inside and took Maeve's hand, their wire rings clicking soft in the stillness. 2 people who had walked away from the rules of the market to find a value that would last as long as the grass grew and the water ran clear beneath the stone. Out here in the territory, the lawyers will tell you that every stick of timber and every bucket of water has a price written down in a county book. They'll tell you that old Barnaby Crone was just following the law of survival when he ordered that sick girl left behind on the dry ridge. But if you ride out past Red Creek when the sun is going down, you'll see that pine schoolhouse standing free against the sky, and you'll know that the cattle kings were wrong. Because there are some things in this country that no bank can ever buy, and no foreclosure paper can ever destroy. The sound of an orphan boy reading his name, the steady breath of a woman who fought for her own life, and the quiet honor of a man who chose to carry the heavy load because it was the right thing to do. Those things don't carry a price tag. They're free to any man or woman who has the courage to reach out their hand and take them. And that's exactly what makes them the only things worth keeping when the winter snow finally falls on the ridge. The author does not encourage or promote dangerous actions, illegal behavior, discrimination, or harmful conduct depicted in this story. Any conflicts, confrontations, or controversial themes shown are fictional elements designed to support the dramatic structure of the narrative.
As this story comes to a close, we are left with more than the memory of a hard Texas summer, a cruel cattle king, and a schoolhouse standing proud beneath the evening sky. We are left with a truth that reaches far beyond Red Creek Valley. A human life can never be measured by usefulness alone. In a world that often asks what a person can produce, how much money they can earn, or how much strength they can give, this story reminds us that every soul carries a value no ledger can calculate. Maeve Gallagher was once seen as weak, sick, and burdensome. Men like Barnaby Crone looked at her and saw only cost, illness, and inconvenience. But Silas Woods saw something deeper. He saw a young woman who still had purpose, dignity, wisdom, and a heart strong enough to teach others, even while her own body was failing. Through Maeve, we learn that a person is not worthless simply because they are wounded. Sometimes, the ones who seem the weakest carry the greatest light. Silas teaches us the meaning of true honor. He did not choose the easy road. He chose the right one. He gave up his savings, his horse, his comfort, and his own security because he understood that doing good is not supposed to be convenient. Real character is revealed when there is no applause, no reward, and no guarantee that the sacrifice will be returned. Silas reminds us that a good man is not defined by what he owns, but by what he is willing to protect. Elijah's story gives this tale another powerful meaning. His ledger proves that justice may be delayed, ignored, and buried beneath years of prejudice. But truth does not disappear. Every hour of stolen labor, every unpaid debt, every wrong done in silence still leaves a mark. And when brave people finally stand together, even the powerful can be brought before the weight of truth. His victory is not just about money. It is about dignity, equality, and the right of every working person to be seen as fully human. Abiley's change of heart may be one of the quietest but most important lessons in the story. Fear can make good people hard. Poverty can make families look at one another like burdens instead of blessings. But love, when it is remembered, can heal what fear has damaged. Abiley learns that land, money, and survival mean nothing if we lose our humanity trying to keep them. A home is not saved by sacrificing the people inside it. A home is saved when its people choose each other. And finally, the Red Creek School stands as the true victory of this story. It is not just a building of cedar logs and pine shingles. It is proof that compassion can become legacy. One act of kindness became a journey. One journey became healing. One healed woman became a teacher. And one teacher opened a door for every child who had once been overlooked. That is how goodness survives. not always through grand speeches or heroic battles, but through small choices made with courage, repeated until they become a future. So when we leave Silas and Maeve standing in that little schoolhouse, we are reminded that the strongest people are not always the richest, the loudest, or the most powerful. The strongest are those who refuse to treat others as disposable. They are the ones who reach out a hand when the world says to walk away. They are the ones who believe that a sick girl can become a teacher. An orphan boy can